Stay quiet. Not polite, not warm, not careful. Just quiet. My mother, Denise Vance, said those words over the phone at 11:42 p.m. with the kind of practiced authority people usually reserve for training a disobedient pet. She didn't ask if I was awake. She didn't ask about the high-profile RICO indictment I had just spent 18 hours finalizing at the U.S. Attorney's Office. To her, my life was a series of technical details that often got in the way of the only thing that mattered, the narrative. And the narrative for tomorrow night was simple. My younger brother, Ethan, was the protagonist. I was the background noise. I was 34 years old, a woman who spent her days staring down cartel lawyers and making life-altering decisions for the Department of Justice. Yet here I was, that being told to diminish my own existence so my brother's engagement dinner wouldn't have any distractions. The distraction, apparently, was me. In the world of federal litigation, I am known for clarity. In a courtroom, every word I speak has a price. I've learned to read the minute shifts in a jury's expression and the tactical silence of a judge. But inside the Vance family home, those same skills were recast as intensity or being difficult. My brother Ethan was 2 years younger, but in the eyes of my parents, he was decades more successful in the ways that counted for their social currency. Ethan was easy. He moved through life like a man who expected the red carpet to unroll itself. Our father, Paul, a man who traded his backbone for a quiet life decades ago, lived to facilitate Denise's version of reality. And in that reality, Ethan was the golden child whose every minor achievement was celebrated like a Nobel Prize, while my career in the federal government was treated like a private hobby I took far too seriously. "He's a federal judge, Elena," my mother whispered, her voice tightening with a mix of awe and terror. She was talking about Audrey's father, Audrey, the woman Ethan was set to marry. "Judge Holloway doesn't care about your little cases. He's here to see Ethan. He's here to see a happy, united family. Do not, and I mean this, do not make tonight about you." I sat in my dark office, the glow of 3 monitors reflecting off my glasses, and felt a familiar cold hollow opening in my chest. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was data. The data told me that no matter how many criminals I put behind bars, I would always be the problem child to a woman who feared my light might outshine her favorite son. To understand the dinner, you have to understand the machinery of our family. Ethan's successes were communal. When he got a mid-level management job at a boutique firm, my mother hosted a cocktail party. When he bought a house he couldn't afford, my father quietly covered the closing costs while bragging to the neighbors about Ethan's real estate savvy. My achievements? They were technicalities. When I was appointed as a federal prosecutor, my mother sighed and asked if the hours would make me too tired to help with Christmas dinner. They didn't understand the law, not because it was complex, but because curiosity was a threat. If they asked what I actually did, they might have to admit that I was the most powerful person in the room, and that didn't fit the script. The night of the dinner, I didn't dress to impress. I dressed to be unassailable. I chose a charcoal gray sheath dress, tailored with the precision of a surgical strike. No jewelry except a vintage watch. I looked like what I was, a woman who dealt in facts. The venue was an Italian restaurant inside a historic D.C. hotel, the kind of place where the walls are thick enough to hide a century of political secrets. It was a room designed for people who didn't need to shout to be heard. When I arrived, my mother was already there, adjusting the silverware as if a misaligned fork might ruin her chance at social ascension. She saw me, and her eyes didn't land on my face. They swept over my dress, searching for a flaw, a reason to critique. Finding none, she looked almost disappointed. "Remember," she hissed as the Holloways were announced. "Ah, quiet." Then came the seating. In D.C., where you sit is who you are. My mother had arranged the table with the strategic cruelty of a general. Ethan and Audrey were at the center, the sun around which we were all expected to orbit. Judge Holloway and his wife were placed directly opposite them. My father was at the head, and me? I was tucked at the very end, next to the breadbasket, half hidden by a decorative pillar. It was a physical manifestation of my status in their hearts, distant, optional, an afterthought. As the first course arrived, I watched the performance. My mother was on, her laugh a pitch too high, her anecdotes about Ethan's childhood carefully scrubbed of any actual character, leaving only a bland, heroic caricature. Judge Holloway sat there, a man of silver hair and eyes that seemed to be weighing the soul of everyone at the table. He was polite, but I could see the professional mask he wore. He had spent 30 years on the bench hearing people lie to him. He knew a performance when he saw one. The conversation revolved around Ethan's bright future. My mother mentioned his keen business mind 3 times before the appetizers were cleared. I stayed quiet, just as I was told. I sipped my wine and watched the micro-expressions of the Holloway family. Audrey was lovely, but there was a flicker of confusion in her eyes every time she looked at me. I realized then that she knew nothing about me. I was the serious sister who lived in the city. I was a shadow. And then it happened. The waiter was clearing the plates for the second course. There was a brief lull in my mother's monologue about Ethan's high school lacrosse captaincy. Judge Holloway leaned back, his gaze drifting away from Ethan's eager face, and for the first time, his eyes locked onto mine at the far end of the table. The air in the room didn't just change, it solidified. "I've been trying to place you all evening," the judge said. His voice wasn't the social chime of the others. It was a gavel. The table went silent. My mother's smile froze in midair. "You're Vance," he said, not as a question, but as a discovery. "From the district office. You led the prosecution on the Sterling case last spring, didn't you?" The Sterling case. A multi-million-dollar money laundering scheme involving 3 offshore banks and a sitting congressman. It had been my life for 2 years. And I felt my mother's hand tighten on her wine glass until her knuckles turned white. She didn't know what the Sterling case was. She only knew that the important man was looking at the unimportant daughter. I set my glass down. I didn't look at my mother. I looked directly at the judge. "I did, Your Honor. It was a complex matter of jurisdictional overlap." "Complex?" Holloway snorted, a genuine spark of interest finally lighting up his face. "It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. I read your closing arguments in the law journal. Sharp, unforgiving. I told my clerks, this is how you build a wall that no one can climb over." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of my mother's carefully constructed facade cracking into 1,000 pieces. But I wasn't done, and neither was he. What he said next, and what my brother did to try and reclaim the spotlight, would be the beginning of the end for the Vance family as we knew it. But before I tell you how the quiet dinner turned into a federal inquiry of my mother's conscience, I told my clerks, this is how you build a wall that no one can climb over. Judge Holloway's words didn't just hang in the air, they acted like a physical weight, crushing the oxygen out of the room. I watched my mother. For a woman who lived for the perfect image, this was her nightmare, a reality she couldn't edit. She looked at me, not with pride, but with a sharp, panicked resentment. To her, my success wasn't a family victory. It was a glitch in the software she'd been running for 34 years. "Oh, Elena has always been modest," my mother said. Her voice had that brittle, high-pitched quality she used when she was lying to herself. She forced a laugh, a sound like glass breaking. "She calls it federal litigation, but we just see it as her being a very busy, very private girl. You know how it is. Judge, young people and their big titles. We just wish she had more time for the family." She was doing it again. In one sentence, she had tried to recast a career-defining federal prosecution as a big title and my professional dedication as a failure to be a good daughter. I felt the familiar urge to stay quiet, to let the awkwardness pass for the sake of Ethan's dinner. But then I looked at Judge Holloway. He wasn't looking at my mother anymore. He was looking at her the way he'd look at a witness who had just committed blatant perjury. "With all due respect, Denise," the judge said, and the "Your Honor" tone was back. "The Sterling case isn't a title. It's a landmark. Your daughter didn't just work on it. She broke it. Most lawyers spend 40 years hoping for a case like that. Elena did it before she was 35. The table went into a deep freeze. My brother, Ethan, tried to jump in. He's always been the one to fix the atmosphere, which usually meant reinforcing our mother's delusions. "Wow, Elle," Ethan said, his voice sounding hollow and unconvincing. "I didn't know you were doing landmark stuff. You always said you were just at the office late." "I was at the office late because the work required it, Ethan," I said. My voice was calm, the same voice I use when I'm cross-examining a hostile witness. But it's hard to share the landmark stuff when the conversation at home is usually about why I didn't return a text about the Thanksgiving centerpiece. Audrey, Ethan's fiancée, leaned forward. She had been silent all night, but now her eyes were darting between my mother and me. "Wait," Audrey whispered. "I thought you worked in research? Denise told me you were in a support role because the pressure of trial was too much for you." I felt the air leave the room again. My mother had lied. She hadn't just omitted the truth. She had constructed a false narrative of my incompetence to make Ethan look more impressive by comparison. At that moment, I realized that my silence wasn't being polite. It was being an accomplice to my own disappearance. I looked at the judge, then at Audrey's mother, Mrs. Holloway. Mrs. Holloway was a woman of quiet power, and the look she gave me wasn't pity. It was a profound, silent recognition. She saw the machine. She saw the golden child, the enabler father, and the narcissistic mother, and she saw the scapegoat who was actually the only one holding the truth. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," my mother started, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "Elena, let's not make a scene. This is Ethan and Audrey's night. We don't need to discuss your office politics." "It's not office politics, Mom," I said, standing up. The movement was slow, deliberate. "It's my life. And for the first time, someone at this table actually looked at me and saw it. You asked me to be quiet tonight so I wouldn't ruin the evening, but what you really meant was you didn't want the Holloways to see that the person you've spent years diminishing is actually someone they respect." I turned to Judge Holloway. "Thank you for the recognition, Your Honor. It means more than you know, coming from someone who values the evidence." Then I looked at Ethan, my little brother, the boy who had been given everything while I was told to be grateful for the crumbs. "Good luck, Ethan. I hope you build a life that doesn't require someone else to stay small so you can feel big." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't wait for the bill. I walked out of that restaurant, and my heels clicking against the marble floor of the hotel lobby with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, fast, steady, and alive. The fallout was immediate. My phone exploded before I even reached my car. 11:15 p.m. Text from Mother. "How could you? You ruined everything. Audrey's father thinks we are liars. You were so selfish." 11:40 p.m. Text from Father. "Elena, please call your mother. She's distraught. It was just a dinner. Why did you have to bring up work?" 12:05 a.m. Text from Ethan. "Audrey is questioning the wedding. She says she doesn't recognize my family. You destroyed my future, Elena. I hope you're happy." I sat in my apartment, the DC skyline twinkling outside my window. I didn't feel guilty. I felt clean. I did what any good prosecutor would do. I looked at the evidence. The evidence showed that my family didn't love me. They loved the version of me they could control. And once that control was gone, so was their love. I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't explain. I didn't argue. Instead, I did the most powerful thing a quiet girl can do. I became a ghost. I blocked every number. I filtered their emails. I declined the invitations to talk it out, which I knew was just another word for becoming the villain again so they could feel like the victims. 6 months later, the dust has settled. I heard through the grapevine that Ethan and Audrey didn't make it. The Holloways didn't want their daughter marrying into a family built on such fragile, dishonest foundations. My mother blames me for her lost social standing. My father still sends the occasional letter, which I return to sender, unopened. But in my world is quiet. But it's a different kind of quiet now. It's not the quiet of being suppressed. It's the quiet of a courtroom after the verdict has been read. It's the quiet of peace. I've learned that family isn't about blood, it's about who has the courage to stand in the light with you. And if the people who raised you require you to stay in the shadows so they can feel the sun, then you owe it to yourself to walk away. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you've ever felt like the quiet one in a room full of noise, remember this: your value isn't determined by those who refuse to see it. Before you go, I have a question for you. Have you ever had to choose between your family's narrative and your own truth? How did you find the strength to walk away? Share your story in the comments. Let's remind each other that we aren't alone, and if this story helped you find a little bit of your own light today, please subscribe. We're building a community here for the survivors, the truth tellers, and the ones who decided that being quiet was no longer an option. My name is Elena Vance, and for the first time in my life, I am finally heard.